I mentioned that the aux component is a so-called higher order component, which is why it's placed in the HOC folder. And it's named higher order component because all it does essentially is it wraps another component. It does not contain its own logic, its own styling, or add any structure to the JSX code or to the real DOM that will be rendered. It just wraps another component and then maybe adds some extra logic to it. Though the aux component here doesn't even add any logic, it's just a technical wrapper. Now, another example for a higher order component that you could create would be a component that sets up a div that contains a class or sets up a class. Like here, in app.js, we're using a div and we're assigning a class there. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that. We're doing the same in our person component, or we did before we added aux. Before we did that, here we also had a div where we assigned that person class. Now, obviously, there is nothing wrong with just using a div with a class name. But this serves as a good example for a custom higher order component you could create that does more than the aux component. So this is simply an example now. I will create a new file in the HOC folder and I'll name it with class.js like this. It's kind of a convention to name higher order components with a with at the beginning, though of course ultimately it's up to you how you name your components. Now, how does the with class component look like? Well, this now needs to import React from React because it will render some JSX. And then I'll name it with class here. And this will be a regular functional component getting props. And then in the end, we'll export with class here so that we can use it in other files. Now, inside of the function body or of the return statement of this function body, which I have here, I will render a div with a class name of, and now that's the fun part, props classes, let's say. And you can name this here classes whatever you want. This will be a property I expect to get on that higher order component. Between my opening and closing tags of the div, I'll then return props children, which again is the entire content between the opening and closing tag of this with class component when we're using it. So this is now my higher order component with class that simply does one thing. It sets up a class on a div that wraps my component. Now, how would we use that? Let's test it in app.js. There, I will import with class like this with a capital W from HOC with class. And now with class can be used instead of the div here. So let me replace div, opening and closing with class. And instead of class name, I will simply pass classes. Because in with class, I'm expecting a classes property. Now, if I do that, as the app reloads, you see it looks exactly the same way as before. So if we check our app CSS file, the text is still aligned in the center. So if it wouldn't work, all our text should be on the left. And of course, if I inspect any of these items here, I can indeed see that we are applying this style here. Now, let me repeat, this is just an example here. Obviously, there would be nothing wrong with sticking to a div. But we'll introduce other higher order components throughout the course where we, for example, add error handling that we can wrap around any component that makes an HTTP request. And all of a sudden, this becomes more useful. The general concept is simply that you have a component that wraps other components that adds something to it. That could be styling, that could be additional HTML structure around it, or that could also be some logic. And we'll add that logic later once we added HTTP requests, as I said, to automatically handle HTTP errors.